What's up guys, my name is Ace, and welcome back to another gun guide. This is the series where I go into great detail with all of the stats as well as some excellent attachment combinations for every gun in Black Ops 6. And in today's episode, we're going to be covering the brand new OIympia shotgun, which doesn't appear in the shotgun category. This is actually a secondary in the special category. And with this, you unlock it in the Beavis and Butthead event, or if you're watching this after the event is over, it should be available in the armory. And with this, unlike the other shotguns in the game, we only fire 6 pellets per shot rather than 8. However, just like with the other shotguns, only 4 of your pellets per shot will be capable of dealing damage to a target. And there's also a hard cap on the damage at 200 per shot. And with the OIympia, in the maximum damage range, basically point blank, we're actually dealing 100 damage per pellet. So it's actually a 1 pellet kill in that very, very short range, which we'll look at in a little bit. Then that drops down to 50, then 34, and then 25, depending on your range. And this means, technically speaking, we're always capable of dealing at least 100 damage per shot. However, I do want to make a mention in that minimum damage range when testing in a controlled environment with perfect accuracy. In all my testing, I've never actually been able to land 4 pellets in a shot, even when aiming down sight perfectly on target. And as a result, realistically speaking, that 100 damage you're actually not going to be experiencing, or if you did, it would be a very rare occurrence. In either case, before we get into our ranges, let's have a look at our rate of fire, which is 171 rounds per minute. Keeping in mind, since this is an over-under shotgun, we only have the 2 shells that will fire at that fire rate, and then you have to reload. So it's not like you can spam that rate of fire at a consistent rate or anything. And what this means is our 2-shot time to kill potential is 350 milliseconds, which is fairly slow. Even if you do spam out those 2 shells, that's a fairly slow time to kill. And then if you need a 3rd shot to kill, you have to factor the reload time in. And now we're looking at like 3.4 seconds, which is insanely slow. Now, as for our ranges, I was actually quite surprised to see how good the range potential is with this, considering the fact that it's a secondary compared to the other shotguns, which I'll put up on the screen here, which are all primary weapons. As you can see, our maximum hit potential is very, very good with this at 40.6 meters. That's way better than the actual shotguns. And our realistic 1-shot kill potential, where we have to hit at least 3 pellets, which is doable if you're aiming down sight at your target, this is 14.8 meters. And like I said, anything beyond that, it becomes essentially impossible to actually hit 4 pellets, even though technically speaking, it should be able to 1-shot. I've never actually seen a 1-shot in that range. But I think one of the biggest numbers to pay attention to here is that 7.4 meter range, because within this, it's a 2 pellet kill. And that means within this range, you should almost always be getting the kill. It'll be quite rare to ever see a hit marker there. It's possible if you only hit 1 pellet. But even with hip fire within 7.4 meters, as long as you're somewhat reasonably centered on target, you're going to get a 1-shot kill far more often than not. And speaking of hipfire, we actually get a pretty solid base spread compared to the other shotguns at 4.5 degrees. However, it is worth noting this is as good as it gets. There are no laser attachments for this that can improve that, unlike with the other shotguns. And we can get that very noticeably tighter when we aim down sight. And based on my hand testing, it appears we're at about 1.44 degrees for our aim down sight spread. So if you're ever within that gap between 7.4 and 14.8 meters, you should definitely be aiming down sight to try to maximize the odds of hitting at least 3 of those pellets. Because in my experience with this, if you try to hit fire at that range, even if you're perfectly centered, it's actually fairly rare that you're going to be landing 3 out of your 6 pellets. Now after that, let's have a look at our reload time. And it turns out with this, it is quite slow at just over 3 seconds. And this doesn't change if you just want to pop 1 shell in or if you want to reload both of those shells. So you might as well just fire both. There's no penalty for firing it right till empty. Then another important stat to consider with this being a secondary weapon is how long does it take to swap to this relative to a pistol. So with my test, I swapped from an XM4 to the secondary weapon. And as we can see, it does take noticeably longer to get the OIympia out and ready to fire compared to a standard pistol like the 9mm PM. So that is one key trade-off and one reason that you may not always want to run this shotgun. Then let's take a look at our handling stats, and our aim down sight time is quite slow at 375 milliseconds. So that's yet another area that holds us back because, like I said, if you're beyond that 7.4 meters, you want to aim down sights, and that's quite a slow aim down sight time. Then our sprint to fire time is not amazing, not horrible. It's 200 milliseconds for our standard sprint out time. And then finally, for our slide to fire and dive to fire times, these are pretty standard for shotguns at 370 milliseconds and 450 milliseconds respectively. And this just leaves us with one last base stat that I wanted to take a look at before we have a look at our attachment possibilities. And these are our mobility stats, which across the board are just standard for a shotgun. And therefore, it is also worth noting, it's not as good as the pistols in this game, so that's another downside to using this as your secondary weapon compared to using a pistol, is you can't get around the map quite as fast, but then again, you could always just switch to your melee weapon if you're just trying to get that extra traversal movement speed. And now that we've got all that out of the way, let's get into the 2 attachment possibilities we have access to, and the first one is the short barrel, which actually changes up how damage works on this. And the first thing this does is it removes that cap on the number of potential pellets that can deal damage per shot. So now all 6 of your pellets when you fire a shot are capable of dealing damage. However, this comes with some pretty serious damage range trade-offs, which we'll look at very soon. And also, our hipfire spread is massively increased, and therefore it becomes significantly less likely that you'll be hitting more than 1 pellet when you fire a shot. And that increase also applies when we aim down sight. You can see that's quite a wide spread there as well. So that's going to very significantly limit your potential of hitting multiple pellets, even though that cap has been eliminated. Now, on top of that, it does improve our aim down sight and sprint to fire times, as well as our reload quickness, so there are a few other benefits that you gain there. But the main thing to focus on here is our damage and range comparison compared to the base OIympia without this barrel. And as we can see, like I said, we see a fairly significant reduction to all of our damage range values, and therefore our new realistic one-shot kill potential if we're aiming down sights and if we get a little bit lucky as well and we hit 3 pellets. But with that wider aim down sight spread, this becomes less consistent even within those ranges. And then our 2 pellet kill potential, which used to be 7.4 meters, it's now just 4.6 meters. So we actually lose a lot of our potential there. And therefore you might be looking at this and wondering why you would ever use the short barrel outside of maybe the handling and reload benefits. Because the fact that they eliminate that cap on how much damage you could potentially deal per shot that you fire is sort of irrelevant if you now become incapable of hitting that many pellets per shot anyway. So I would say in most situations, you're better off without the short barrel. However, there is something to be said for this. With that wider spread, if you find yourself in very close quarters situations and you end up dealing with multiple enemies that are side by side or at least reasonably centered on your screen, you got a much better chance of killing multiple enemies with a single shot fired with this. So especially on really close quarters maps like Stakeout, where enemies are often funneled into like doorways, for instance, this will allow you to kill multiple enemies more effectively. And also with that wider spread, if you find yourself within that maximum damage range where you only need to land 1 pellet anyway, at that point, the wider your spread is, the better, because it makes it that much more forgiving and more likely that that enemy is going to be standing somewhere within the spread of your gun. Now, outside of tiny maps like Stakeout 24/7, I would say the short barrel is actually going to be detrimental to your performance overall. And therefore, for me, I don't plan on running the short barrel much, if at all. As for the only other attachment that we're capable of using on this is the cutoff stock, which improves our aim down sight and sprint to fire times. And it comes at the cost of more recoil, which realistically, recoil doesn't matter all that much with this gun. For this one, absolutely, I'd recommend throwing it on there because the more help you can get to aim down sight and sprint out time, the better. And that's basically going to be my go-to class setup with the OIympia, is just running the cutoff stock without the short barrel. However, if you play on Stakeout a lot, then maybe I could see a good argument for using the short barrel, but even then, I wouldn't say it's like a no-brainer or anything. And there we go. That is going to wrap it up for today's gun guide on the brand new OIympia shotgun in the special category in Black Ops 6. And when it comes to my overall thoughts on this, I actually quite like this implementation. I think it does fit as a secondary weapon. There is a lot of potential there for sure, but it does have some clear downsides compared to pistols as well. It's going to take you longer to get that out. So if you just want to finish an enemy off, maybe you've hurt them really good with your primary and you just need to land that 1 extra bullet, well, in that case, a pistol is actually going to be your better bet because you can get it out faster and get that shot off faster. If, however, you're out of ammo with your primary weapon, for instance, and you've got another enemy coming and they have full health, in that case, I would probably rather have the OIympia in my hands, assuming I've got enough time to get it out and get it ready. But then to add a little more nuance to the conversation, what if another enemy comes after that? Well, if I happen to have fired both of my shots, now you're kind of screwed because you have that really long reload time. Whereas with a pistol, you could just keep spamming and potentially getting several kills per magazine before having to reload. And I think the fact that it kind of goes back and forth like that is a sign that it is reasonably balanced compared to the other secondaries. Now, of course, those are just my thoughts on the OIympia shotgun, and this is where I want to hear from you guys in those comments down below. How are you feeling about this shotgun, especially with it being a secondary weapon in Black Ops 6? Do you guys like how this is balanced? Or maybe not? Do you guys think it's overpowered for a secondary or maybe underpowered? Just let me know all of those thoughts down below. If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.